first.
No, hold on. I'm going to start recording. Hold on. Welcome to the Digital Roundtable. We have an interesting show today. There is a freeze going on in North America, and we would love to let you know what's going to happen. Lots of opinions about how this came about. We're excited. Let me ask John Butler to kick us in and get us in the mood. So let's go, Johnny.
To all the girls I've loved before, who traveled in and out my door, so glad they came along. I dedicate this song to all the girls I've loved before. That's my small guitar. Look how little it is.
Yeah. No, that's perfect, John. John, tell us, how are you? You are in your house. Tell us your current condition with the freeze. What's happening?
Right now, I am sitting in my car, and I thought that I do not want my cell phone to go out, so I'm sitting in my car where I come to charge my cell phone, having the best show in America, being with my friends. We have running water. We have heat, hot water, and cold water. That's because part of my house is gas, and the other part of it is electricity. It is completely snowy outside. I measured 7 inches. This morning, it turned to ice. The governor and ERCOT has been, that is the ERCOT, nobody knew what ERCOT was until us, right? The energy reliable, whatever, for Texas. So it is miserable, but it is like, as the old saying goes, it is like being in Alaska and the temperature is 100 degrees and no air conditioning. But the governor had a great comment for somebody from New York. They said, well, Governor, we see trucks on the road. We see ice stuff on the road. How could Texas get so many trucks so fast? And the governor said, well, you know that Lubbock is closer to Denver than it is to Austin. So we're going to try to make do. It is a mess. I cannot believe we are out this much. And it has to be some kind of issue with the grid. And I also understand that Mexico is also sharing our grid. So Austin is a complete mess. It is completely shut down, but the spirit of Texas will never shut down.
Yeah. Thank you, Johnny. Llewelyn, how are you today? Tell us what's your condition. The storm seems to be hitting.
I'm very well. I'm in the icebound Providence, Rhode Island, which is sunny and very pleasant. The roads are clear. The electricity is on. The water is flowing. And despite New England, with its legendary bad weather, is doing very nicely. Thank you. My heart really goes out to the people of Texas. So there must be terrible suffering. And I see there were a lot of deaths, some of which are from carbon monoxide poisoning, which means people have been trying to keep warm by probably burning ovens and things and getting low on the ground. I imagine that's the cause of the carbon monoxide. Or they've had these generators in the house, the gasoline generators in the house. Carbon monoxide is a silent killer. It's a grave one in all prices where people are trying to keep warm and doing unconventional.
It is.
Your volume is going. Get closer. I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. It's very unfortunate that this happens, that we have carbon monoxide poisoning when we have freezes, because people do what they can to keep warm, and it can be lethal. Particularly these generators that you buy at the hardware store, you plug in, you use gasoline to fire them up. They need to be outside with the cord coming inside with the juice. If you have them inside, you're going to build up carbon monoxide, and you'll very likely have deaths or other disadvantageous things.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well said. It's a safety issues that people need to be trained, and a lot of people don't know. It's their first time in this scenario. So I'm sorry to say though that this is a crisis that is impacting 17 states. primarily in the sort of the center of the United States, the Midwest South, the spine of the country, anywhere from Texas to North Dakota and the like, and as far as Kentucky and Arkansas and states like that. And so FERC and the Federal Electric Regulatory Commission and NERC, the North America Electric Regulatory Commission, are launching an investigation on what happened in the 17 states and learn from it, and perhaps determine what could be done to prevent this from happening in the future. Here in Texas in particular, we're having some serious impact, just primarily, I think, a big part of it, and we stated a position on the that I shared with you all earlier today, where we think that, the challenge is not, this could have been avoided in many ways if we had a different policy around the backup resources for the grid. Unfortunately, the backup resources for the grid were 3% at the time of the storm. And by doing back of the envelope math, if we would have had 20% backup capabilities on standby, we probably would have had no outages. So it's really something that the state could have, contracted in advance and planned for it if they had a different policy on the percentage. Unfortunately, Andres,
you've got a perfect storm.
We cannot hear you, Llewelyn. Get closer.
You've got a perfect storm. You have the lack of backup, the lack of reserve margins, which have been whittled away over time. You have a disinclination under regulation to spend money on non-producing assets, which are backup assets. Mm-hmm. They're non-earning assets. You have to have them, but the tendency is to, if nothing goes wrong for a number of years, to think they're surplus to requirements. And you have a classic engineering situation where design parameters did not conceive that Texas will be covered in snow and ice. It wasn't conceived, like Fukushima. It wasn't conceivable. And it was outside of the imaginable design parameter, which clearly was in error. And now you'll probably have, in 3 years, a backup situation which will last 100 years and never be used. That's the nature of these physical events. But we're also looking at the whole of the United States being subject to strange weather-generated phenomena. The East Coast can be flooded very easily with high tides and king tides and simply winds blowing onshore, driving water onto low-lying areas. We see the evidence of rising sea levels, and from Boston to Miami, cities on the East Coast are in trouble, some on the West Coast, and some in the Gulf. The world is changing, the change is for real, and we have to accommodate our designs to the changed reality, not to the belief that things will return to the status quo ante. You know what the status quo ante is? It's something that's happened that's not coming back. It doesn't come back. We don't go back to where we were. When the pandemic is over, we're not going back to how things were before the pandemic. Big changes are taking place in society, and we have to design and engineer for them, not to believe that somehow we can overcome them by just waiting.
Agreed. John, I want to get your comment on.
I agree with that.
Insight on something. Hold on, John. Yeah, let me rephrase this. So we had a pandemic going on. We had an economic situation going on, and now you layer on top this outage, which is impacting 17 states. How do we need to think differently, John? What needs to be done here to take into consideration this layer?
Well, first of all, as Llewelyn said, it was a perfect storm. And it's also true that we tend to put up the stop sign after the accident has happened. It's absolutely correct. If you look at the ancient world, all of the great cities that were along seacoasts are now under the sea. But let's look at how preparation for these things and how we think about the future and how we think about the models. Llewelyn is correct in the sense that we could not anticipate or did not anticipate, for example, the whole idea that our windmills would be covered with snow. As you know better than me, we probably get 20 to 25% of our energy from the West Texas windmills. So that brings into a question, what do we do for the future? Of course, if you look at all of our commentary, now it's about fossil fuels. It's about what would be the place of all the renewable energy that Texas has invested in over the last number of years, to the chagrin of the fossil fuels. So one of the things that's going to happen from a policy point of view is the relationship between how we think about fueling America and what renewable energy can actually do. I'm sure that my colleagues from the university who've got Teslas and electric cars are having a tough time. The other thing we have to do is really think about how we bring energy to the country. Do we invest in going underground? Do we look at the nuclear stuff more seriously? Do we look at all these things? So we have a perfect storm of not only engineering, as Llewelyn has brought out, but on top of that is the pandemic, which is another kind of interesting storm, but it is world round. It is all around the globe. So what we do is this. We have to bring, as we always do in America, we have to bring those people to the table and ask, what happened? Who's responsible? Could it have been prevented? And what do we do in the future? So the perfect storm of a pandemic, the failure in engineering, and the reality of the future rising coastlines is bringing a perfect storm times 2. Let's call it perfect storm squared, in this case, perfect storm 3. So I think we will have all the commissions. I think the state of Texas will look at ERCOT, which nobody knew about, but us who doing stuff on the grid. And then we'll come up with a model for the future that might change our entire way of how we bring electricity to America. So one thing about ERCOT, is that, I don't know if people know, because it is a holding company for all of the other kinds of electrical co-ops that we have, let's call them co-ops around the state. So they manage them. And so what that means is they can put it where it need be. Well, obviously, the demand was much higher than the supply. And what they did, Llewelyn, was they cut off everything that was not essential. So if I were right next to a hospital, I would probably be good. One of the big complaints about what's going on now is that downtown Austin is booming in lights, but the neighborhoods are not. So we're going to sit down and we're going to look at it. It's going to be from an engineering point of view. It's going to be from a policy point of view. But my question is, what would this do to the relationship between renewable energy that we invest in and traditional fossil fuels? What I hear on the radio is fossil fuels saved us. Yeah. I have not heard anybody say that renewable energy will save us. So that's where we are.
I would throw in one other, and that is nuclear, which tends, not always, they've had freeze-ups at plants, but tends to survive most of these things because of the nature, the concentrated nature of a nuclear power plant, the very high put-out energy in relation, the energy density of it is how they say. We also might want to look at ERCOT itself, which is the unconnected, freestanding Texas grid. It is slightly connected. There's a connection into Mexico, and there are 2 connections to the east, I think. But it is not a part of when we say the grid, the national grid, it does not include Texas. And that's political because Texas did not want the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and its predecessor, the Federal Power Commission, interfering in any way in internal affairs in Texas. And so it's a rather anomalous situation. It's a political construct. It's not an engineering construct. In terms of pure engineering, it makes no sense.
But what's interesting about it is it took all of these independent electric companies and rolled them up. It was like me taking all the McDonald's and rolling them up and then telling McDonald's how much energy I could deliver. Actually, our grid in Austin is not, of course, ERCOT. Our grid in Austin is what we call, you know, the Austin grid, right? Mr. Engineer that did it. But we cannot do anything unless ERCOT gives the AOK. So in an interesting kind of way, right now, our grid in Austin could turn on all the lights. But ERCOT would say it would break up the equilibrium for the whole state. So therefore, they have to manage. It's like managed care. It's like managed medical care. So we're in a situation where not only it is political historically, but it is under management. And anything that's under management and not entrepreneur can be very, very troublesome.
Yeah.
The very conspicuous thing about what's happened in Texas has been with electric supply. But you also have roads iced over. You have many other disturbances created by aberrant weather. We've got to learn to anticipate and to live with aberrant weather. Weather is not as stable as it has been heretofore. Yeah, no, this state, Llewelyn, I had the fortune of having lived in Pennsylvania and in Kansas, and this state is not equipped for this. There's no trucks, there are no plows, enough equipment to deal with this, and so clearly, again, I was jokingly with you guys before our broadcast here that maybe this thing climate change is for real and it's happening. What do you think? Oh, I think the climate change is for real, and there's evidence of it everywhere. It's not in dispute, except the last president disputed it for reasons that we don't really understand.
Yes, of course, climate change. I tell my clients, let's ask the dinosaurs about climate change. Obviously, we are very, very dynamic. We're not static. The Earth has always been dynamic. Anthropology tells us that, and history tells us that. In a real sense, technology, if you will, is the tendency or the wish for people to control the environment. The wish to be very, very warm when it is very, very cool. The wish to go over mountains when we can fly. The wish to create food when there are deserts. So what we've done through agriculture and et cetera is to really, really try and maintain and control our environment. Right now, what we have is a situation, it will continuously change. And as Llewelyn said earlier, we have to come up with other solutions to look at the whole idea of how it is changed and how things are in continual movement and not going toward any kind of equilibrium. So what do we do with cities on the West Coast that's eroding away? What do we do with Louisiana that's losing a lot of its land? So the question is not necessarily the movement of change of the earth. It is Newtonian emphasis that says that things are dynamic and they're actually changing. And we've got to continue to change as people have always done since the earth was part of us, so that we can try and control, if you will, the environment. And we have done this very well with technology. Of course, when technology fails, whether it's a Titanic moving people from one continent to another, where's an airplane crash, then it brings a lot of grief to us. But we will continue to try to change and manage our environment. This is what human is all about, trying to manage the environment that we're in. The first thing, though, for management is you've got to recognize you've got a problem. Denying it doesn't work. But we also get periodically hugely aberrant weather, as you've got in Texas. I was living in London during the great snow, the great freeze of 1962. Nothing had been seen like it, they thought, in a generation, maybe several generations, and nothing has been seen like it since. It was a one-time event, and you may have that in Texas. It didn't stop people building against it happening again,
But overall, the climate has been warming for a very long time. 300 years ago, it was much colder everywhere, and it's going to continue to warm. Now, we're probably contributing, accelerating that warming with our burning of fossil fuel. My own feeling is we wouldn't arrest it totally if we stopped burning fossil fuels and stopped flying aircraft and laying down a nitrous oxide layer at high levels. But it will come more slowly, therefore it'll be more manageable. But change happens. I mean, the whole history of the world is a history, as Johnny has said, of dynamic change.
And one of the things, can I add one more thing?
Hold on.
One more thing.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
So what happens is, what Llewelyn is talking about, we look for things to come back to normal, whether we're trying to predict the stock market. We might call this, in statistics, we call this a random walk. We might say that a stock or the weather itself, when we model it, right? There's a lot of harsh weather. We're really, really freezing to death, but maybe that's a random walk in our model. And that means that the random walk will always come back to some period of equilibrium. But maybe this random walk is not a random walk in history, statistically, but it might be a new trend or a new mode that would give us a way of trying to predict what we try to do. So it's important for us not to think in terms of just something being a random walk. That is, the stock will always return at a regression toward the mean. You might have outliers, but it's just a random walk, and it will always come back to the source.
Yeah. So let me summarize what we're talking about, and let me offer 3 solutions for those listening. So energy markets are showing signs of fragility right now in 17 states due to not having enough natural turbines on reserves, plus not having any sizable multiple types of energy storage, enough natural gas storage, enough battery energy storage, on and on and on for backup. Wind and solar production were not available at all as needed. You know, there were some, but not as much as usually they perform due to the weather. And this is one of the cornerstone challenges of us moving forward and getting rid of CO2. So the first solution, change policy and rules for generators and reserve margins. And we must invest in better backup systems. Second, the Texas smart grid needs to be expanded as well. We need to build a two-way power flow, two-way data flow, monitoring and control, using private LTE 5G networks to perform with real-time needs like is required to manage this new grid. And the rolling blackouts and how the rolling blackouts have been performed has been devastating. In fact, the whole communication to the customer, the fact that John Butler is sitting in his garage not knowing when the power is coming back is just the right way of doing this. So we should refine the power system architecture for this use case. And utilities must become far more proactive and predictive with systems when dealing with customers and their expectations. So another solution, build interactive, proactive, and predictive cloud-based websites, texting capabilities, and CRM systems using artificial intelligence. The technology is here. It has been here for a while. The architectures are here. We did this in Austin Energy a long time ago. And so it's shocking to me, Johnny, that the world is still pretending that this is not needed or that we cannot afford it.
Well, what we have here in your comments are contained, right, the source of the big data, what we can do with the big data, the whole idea that we need another grid edge for the utilities. And also when you say that, look, why haven't we done that? We've discussed this before. Whenever you have a public-private partnership, and let's say this, as I've said many times here, the grid was doing fine. Why should I change the technology. So the question is, how do me and you get together, which we'll do, and call a conference on the grid and say the following: what do we need to do in terms of technology? Now, as we know, and you know much better than me, given that you have 16 books on the topic, you know that we have the technology to do everything to make this grid futuristic. We have the technology to make it interactive with human beings. We have the technology to really control the grid edge. That is going not necessarily from the edge to the house, but from the production plant to the edge of the grid, right? We have all of that in place. We have spent billions of dollars, not millions of dollars. Almost every component of the federal government has done research on the grid. So DOD has a grid component. The Department of Energy has a grid component. If you look at all of those reports, what they're doing is just stacking old technology and expanding on the old technology. So I would have to ask you, how do we have a revolution in the technology of the grid stuff? Because as you said, everything is sitting on the shelf. Well, why should Maine change when it's been good to them? It's been good to them financially. So as I asked before, how do you change a product when the product is still producing and you talk to management and you really have to enter the new technology?
Llewelyn.
I cannot endorse totally what either of you have said. The problem is not the slow pace of interconductivity. The problem is storage. We have lagged in developing ways of storing electricity, and now it looks as though we may not store it at all, but we may make a third product, hydrogen, which accomplishes storage. It doesn't matter how good your AI is. If you don't have the product, you don't have the product. All the AI will do is tell you how severe the shortage is. When you have a lot of diverse generation from solar, from wind, from wave power, from whatever, you're going to need to be able to save the excess production for a time when it is needed. It looks to me, and there are technological problems, that hydrogen might offer this. The Europeans, who are putting huge bucks into hydrogen, believe that they can do it by having an excess of production in the North Sea from wind turbines all over the North Sea, and that they can put the hydrogen into their system. I don't think they can, because I think hydrogen is difficult to handle and you need special handling for it. But it is the best thing on the shelf at the moment, and it is de facto on the shelf.
Llewelyn, help me understand something. The current focus in the country are to get to 100% decarbonization. That's what's driving the country right now. We are going to get rid of fossil fuels. We're going to get rid of gasoline vehicles. What will happen 6 years from now when everybody forgets what happened today and we have windmills and solar panels running the whole country, and a storm like this hits again? How many people will die that day?
That is inevitable. I think if we're going to go down the solar and wind path, we're going to have other disasters, and the best amelioration we can envisage is having stored enough electricity in some medium that will store it, and batteries don't do it, or today's batteries don't, because their drawdown time tends to be 4 or the best case 8 hours, and you need very long drawdown times to overcome crises like this one. It is a case that if you are going to go with diversified power, which is politically appealing, it's culturally appealing. The sun and the wind, isn't it wonderful? Which is not as cheap or as free or as bounteous or without pollution, as its advocates would have you believe, and we have been held up by the environmentalists often. They were the ones who pushed us into coal. I sat through innumerable meetings and heard the virtues of carbon, of fluidized coal beds rather than nuclear. Anything but nuclear drove us to coal. Natural gas came along, and it was a fabulous fuel for electric utility, a great way to make electricity, but it does produce carbon. Our best options now are to go back to nuclear, to store a lot of electricity, and if we're making in hydrogen, but we're not going to do it like that. I would throw out this, though. We're going to have to spend more money, and electricity is surprisingly cheap. It is not, for the homeowner, an expensive buy. The cable television, now that's an expensive buy compared to electricity. In almost all homes, the cost of cable exceeds the cost of something useful, which is electricity. So that if we saw a general rise in the cost of electricity, provided it was intelligently used to do something about these discrepancies in power generation that come and bite us whenever there are severe weather conditions or when there simply is no wind. In Texas, the largest most wind-dependent state, you have wind droughts. It just doesn't blow. There's nothing there. You can have the best artificial intelligence on earth and connectivity. If the wind isn't blowing, the kilowatts are not flowing.
Well, let me just say this. I was talking to Laura.
So Johnny, chime in. Help us understand this conundrum. It's a conundrum, right? The country's going one way, and nature is showing us that may be not the right way.
Absolutely. I was talking to Laura Kiltrees, who is the Chief Innovation Officer now in Canada, and they're doing a lot with hydrogen. But we also know whether it's floods, whether it's hurricanes, the natural things that we try to control can really have a great impact on how policy changes. There's absolutely no reason why we cannot switch back to politically from an emphasis totally on wind and et cetera, to a mixture of fossil fuels. So therefore, the idea of the reality of the data, and our data are the same data that ancient people saw, is the same data when they saw the great oceans around the globe. And the question is, how do you live in this stuff? I do not believe that when we continue the policy of just natural, let's just call it natural producing energy in the future, if the reality of the data says that Mother Earth is kicking back hard and it just will not work. Now, the question is it going to be political? But what I see is a mixture of solutions. I think we should invest equally in both doing away with carbon, or natural energy, as I like to call it, right? And the reality of fossil fuels. And I think also, just as we have lots of experiments with hydrogen, and as Llewelyn said, you got to use electricity. We can't catch lightning in a bottle as of yet, right? But the reality is that I'm listening to the radio and people are saying, where are the fossil fuels? I'm listening to the radio and people are saying our windmills in West Texas were completely frozen. I'm listening, and in Mexico, the pipeline between the United States and Mexico is also completely frozen. Now, whether or not this is a random walk that we return to normal is another question. But policy-wise, we cannot always put all of our eggs in one basket. My buddy who won the Nobel Prize at the University of Chicago for investing would say, look, when you invest in the stock market, you do not put all of your money in one basket. So what I see then, why not have a mixed model of energy, with both being equally interesting and one being having to control more in terms of the environment. We have to do that. We cannot just say we're going straight forward with the elimination of fossil fuels, the elimination of carbon. We've got to say, we got to find a way to see what we can do with carbon. We got to find a way to put in a dollar. We got to find a way to make it useful. So science will save us again, but we need people who understand policy and that you never put one policy in one basket.
I agree 300%. Llewelyn.
I want to introduce something that won't make anybody very happy, but that is you're going to see a lot of federal intervention from the Biden administration, which already was poised to push solar and wind at the cost of almost everything else. And now they're going to be incentivized to start messing with the grid. So we're going to see a lot of federal initiatives, most of which will be counterproductive.
I think so. I think the Marion administration has changed. That is, again, I will not encourage the president to put all of his investments in one stock. And it is a general proposition of science that if you diversify things, then when things go wrong, then the other thing can pick it up. Okay, we do this in finance. We do this in love and hate. We do this in all kinds of things. So why not take the mathematical formula that says, okay, America will have a mixed model. It is not political. It is reality. It is what the science says we should do. So don't tell all Americans that they've got to invest in one John Sibley Butler stock. They should look at the stock market, evaluate it, see what goes up and what goes down. In our case, as we've always done, the stock market is now the weather. It is whether or not the weather will cooperate with us and whether or not we have planned as humans to live through the worst disaster, including tsunamis, including hurricanes in New Orleans. I mean, the Dutch have lived underneath the water for years. New Orleans is still underwater and has problems. There's no reason why could not have technology could not have fixed the city of my birth and the city that I love. So I'm just saying the Biden administration will have to change. The senators and the congressmen will have to change. And what that means, Llewelyn, is a big taste of Texas coming. That's all that means.
Well, it's a difficult time to advocate Texas as a shining example of a desirable future.
Well, the problem is you got all them damn windmills out there in West Texas now.
I think it's actually when the analysis gets finished, it will show dramatically that if the states where this storm happened were relying 100% on renewable energy, they would have been crushed.
I think that nonetheless, you've got the powerful influence of the progressives leaning on Biden, leaning on their idea of the utopian future, which is wind and energy, maybe waves, but certainly is not what is needed, which is a base of solid nuclear power and a lot of research in how we can burn natural gas and capture the carbon. It is ridiculous to deny ourselves this great resource without spending a bit more effort into seeing how we can burn it effectively. Also, there is the case of global balancing. China, although it is trying very hard, still generates 60% of its electricity from coal. It is much better. It would be much better if they generated 60% of the electricity from natural gas. India, which is one of the great markets for electric generation these days, is going for nuclear, but still burns an enormous amount of fossil fuels, from coal to gas to dung patties. So that there's got to be a global balance in this. You cannot have virtue over here and corruption over there. That doesn't work. It's a global problem. It needs global solutions, and overdoing the virtue at home will not solve the global problem.
You're right, but
Yeah.
we don't want dependency. We don't want dependency. That is, if we stop a pipeline, we don't want China to say, well, we will provide the fossil fuels. If we stop a pipeline, we don't want China to say we'll pick that slack up, or Europe would say we'll slack that up. So again, you look at the data and you make decisions based on the data and based on the science, and you let the what I feel go by the wayside.
Okay?
Yeah.
Fossil fuels tend to have most of their technology domestic. Steel is still produced domestically. And steel, by the way, is very nice stuff because you can recycle it, which you can't a lot of the new materials. But what we have is we are going for the desirability of renewables, but we're importing almost everything it takes to make them. We're importing rare earths, lithium, all of these things that are now essential in a wind turbine and essential in a solar cell. So we have overcome our fossil fuel dependence on the world and substituted a dependence for very rare earth materials. It is a critical time. We've got to look at that. This is a head in the sand to look around and say, oh, good, that's beautiful. There's a windmill. What's in it is Chinese. It's not American. It's the only American thing is the wind.
Yes,
That's right. That's
that
right.
is dependent
So
on
let
the
me yeah, let me change topics to something that I think dovetails into what we're about and impacts what we're talking about. And it is this whole notion of Bitcoin and digital currencies as an impact. And there's a relationship with the energy industry and smart grids, because the largest new industries to develop that requires electrification is the creation of Bitcoins, the harvesting of the coins. So I want to get your thoughts as we're closing here for today, to switch a little topic that I think is super profound. So the city of Miami had a vote in council last week, and they voted 4-1 to explore adopting payments, paying their own employees, and procuring products using Bitcoin. Miami wants to be the Bitcoin city. And one of the biggest drivers for that is the international economy and the relationship with South America, which are currencies that are in trouble. And Bitcoin is a temptation to bring in an incredible amount of, call it, unregulated economies under one roof. What are you guys' thoughts of Bitcoin being a hog on the grid, people all over wanting to be harvesting Bitcoin? Where are we heading here as Bitcoin hit $50,000 per coin?
Well, look, Andreas, I mean, prior to the Civil War, many states had their own currency. Prior to the Civil War, many banks had their own currency. So this is a return to currency independence, but instead it's on your computer. And to me, it's much like the .com era, when everybody was investing in buildings.com, go to sleep.com, I'm hungry.com, when they saw the internet coming as a new way of doing business. If you go back and look at the monetary policy, and when they went down there to Sea Island, right, and created the central bank, the question is always, when things go wrong, who backs it? I think Bitcoin is very, very interesting. It is very volatile. That is, it moves away from the standard deviation, away from the mean to the standard deviation very, very fast and very, very quickly. But I'm not sold on it yet. I never was sold on Confederate money either. I was never sold on the money that came from the Bank of San Francisco. If you have an integrated economy, it means that we have to have ways of moving goods and services based on payments. But as you said, ever since the Cuban miracle, as I call it in Miami, when Miami was just a decaying city, and Castro said there will be a new Havana. Well, that new Havana was Miami, because all of the entrepreneurs got on the boat and came and revitalized the city. So I can see that Cuba has really, really revitalized everything south of it. So for them to have a relationship in terms of the payment of money is absolutely good. But the question is, how will they interact with the rest of America? For me, that does a lot of stock market stuff. I am not ready for it yet. I might be wrong. I think it's just like the dot-com era when everybody wanted to go on the internet and create, and we had big bubbles all over the place. So that's my take on Bitcoin. And also, if you lose your laptop, until we get to the point where we can have it in a central server where everything is completely transparent, and we have that technology here, then it might be good in the future. But right now, I think it's just a dot-com era.
I am very dubious about Bitcoin, partly because I don't fully understand it, although I've tried quite hard over quite a long period. My first concern with it was what happens if you make a mistake. It's indelible, you cannot correct it. You have to have a separate entry to try to invalidate what is wrong, which is very difficult to do. But right at the moment, this is a haywire thing. It is like the .com, and you cannot conduct any kind of commerce when the currency is wildly fluctuating in value. I don't know if any of you have ever been in a country where you got out of control inflation, for example. I was in Israel when it was 800% or something. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't, from the time you bought something, it went up in price by the time you paid for it. And the shopkeeper lost and you gained. It was chaotic. And of course, in my homeland of Zimbabwe, it got worse. It went 10,000% inflation and madness. It seems to me that it has a huge capacity for people to lose money, and not so certain who is going to make money. Certainly for the amateur, for the ordinary person who buys and sells and gets a salary, keep off it, I would say, till it settles down, and stay with the fiat currencies, the traditional currencies. All this is, at the end of the day, is a new currency. If you think of gold as a currency, silver as a currency, sterling as a currency, the dollar as a currency, this is a new currency, but a magnificently unstable one. Stay away from it unless you understand it very well and you enjoy sitting at the gaming tables.
So what why would a city like Miami take a leap of faith of such a nature?
I have no idea.
Well, I think you said it. If you look at the people that do business, you remember that Miami has a great, they're really, really value add, in addition to being Miami and a great place to be, is that they really created commerce throughout Latin America. And when I say they created commerce, they really enhanced commerce throughout America. So it makes sense for them to think of ways to do business with other parts in Latin America where they can have a currency that they can utilize. It would be very, very interesting for them to do that. I think would be a bit, it's a leap of faith. But as Llewelyn just said, it's another currency. It could have been rocks. It could have been fish. It could have been coin. But this thing, which is electronic in nature, I could start my own traditionally, right? But if you look at what the big central banks are doing, they're also taking a look at it. But I think the volatility is too great. And I think we don't have enough data on it for me to make a decision on it. I just stay away from those things that are very, very volatile, including people, by the way.
I see the rationale for an enterprise to have a portfolio approach to adopting Bitcoin in a world that is going digital, just because you may need to have a digital instrument to buy and sell what you make. But I find it incredibly pioneering, maybe delusional, the notion of allowing employees to get paid on Bitcoin. And what are the ramifications long term if I take my salary on Bitcoin, in a year from now, Bitcoin is worth nothing? I mean, can I sue the city for allowing me to do that? I mean, what's going to happen?
Well, you know, in the American dollar,
How
it's the God we trust. And ever since the
how-
meeting back in Seaside Island, it's not attached to the dollar also, but we do it because it's a trust note. It's not necessarily a bank. But
Yeah.
I don't know if you can sue, but Bitcoin, I would sue. Yes.
how are you going to redeem
Sorry,
it?
Llewellyn.
If you, no, I apologize for running over you. How do you redeem it? I mean, if you get your paycheck, supposing you're a janitor working in Miami, and
Right.
you get paid in Bitcoin, which you don't understand, where do you take it? Can you actually go down and buy groceries with it? And what happens if you tell your uncle from whom you rent a room that you're paying him in Bitcoin? Um, uh, I tell you, Bitcoin will have arrived when the drug dealers take it up.
Well, maybe they already have. Maybe they are the number one. The one. We don't know who's driving the prices of Bitcoin. I mean, honestly, I mean, it's crazy, right? I mean, it's totally unpredictable what's going to happen with that.
It's doing interesting things, or the
Absolutely.
data mining that's underneath it is doing interesting things to electricity consumption. It can be very intensive.
Absolutely.
And that can be quite perverting to an electric system. Here is a demand. The electric utilities are looking at electric vehicles and demand of that nature. And here comes out of left field this strange thing called data mining.
That's right. That's right. And so the coin harvesting, which will be a new IRS job employment classification, it's for real. And in Clark County, in the state of Washington, 2 years ago, they started banning giving Bitcoin licenses, the harvesting license, because they were flooding. People were moving from all of with the West Coast to Clark County, which is a hydro county, and because Clark County started issuing, coin harvesting permits, and they got like 1 million permits, requests, and they only issued like 1,000 of them, and they basically banned the whole thing because they're like, oh my God, what's going to happen, right? And so it's kind of fascinating that this digital world is really continues to surprise us, but it's like the social media stuff. There are waves and tsunamis of transformation hitting us, right? And the grid and how the grid is being managed and where we're heading and the new products that are being used to create jobs and commerce are just so unpredictable. I mean, none of us would have thought of Twitter 20 years ago, let alone God, what's going to happen 10 years from now as renewable energy and the new grid emerges and all the things that we're trying to do with vehicle electrification. I mean, the number of new things and platforms and challenges that are going to emerge are tremendous. And so it goes back to Johnny, go back to business models, right? I mean, ultimately,
Certainly it
it
goes
is
back to
it is the winning models, the winning models that make it, right?
right. And Twitter will be replaced with chat sessions. There's a new model now where you can go on and I could chat with Andre Carvalho. If I see that you're online, I could bring you up and put you on the platform. I could chat with a Michael Dale. I could chat with great people of industry, or I can chat with sport figures. But the business models themselves ask one question: how do you bring in revenue based on the model? And what's happening now is that technology, including the Bitcoin, will change the business model. Now, what happens is like the big central banks, they'll take a look at it because they're not sure of what's going on. But remember, the janitor who cannot cash his check is different than the central bank who has billions of dollars to play around with Bitcoin.
I will tell you, right. As a matter of interest, I went up to MIT a couple of years ago to a conference on this, and it was overrun by the banks, looking at it, trying to understand it, wanting to get into it, but being nonetheless tentative because banks are by nature tentative. It was very interesting to see a predominance in the audience were people from the banks, not people from AI or people from the computer world, but people from the banks who wanted an explanation from MIT experts in how all this worked.
Right.
Absolutely. You know,
Right.
if that conference had been at the University of Texas, we'd be much further along now. I just want to put that in.
I mean, the new ice age is an indication of Texas abilities.
Hey, we
Everything
are
begins in.
Well, I think so. You know, when I asked Andre Carvalho, how does Texas keep up with the Joneses? He says, we are the Joneses. So when the Joneses have a little problem, then people tend to put a big emphasis. But the Joneses will be back. We have a lot of problems. And there will be new business models to come out of this crisis.
Well,
and one of them is,
it used to be that the Soviet Union claimed they had invented everything first. Everything came out of the Soviet. I'm glad to see, amazingly, that Texas has replaced the Soviet Union.
you know, in a lot of ways, that's very apropos, because to me, ERCOT is very, very similar to the grid in the Soviet Union and what they did. What do you think, Andreas?
It's what happens when you get central planning.
Yes. So I think what happens when you get central planning and put everything in one basket. So that's a very great observation, Llewelyn, in the sense that it looks like that we have a Soviet type of management here in independent Texas around the grid. And
yeah, the caveat to for those that are listening is that unfortunately the affordability of an intelligent grid is really only at the hands of a few. So when you look at AMI and the power grid and all these technologies managing the grid, it's only in the Dallas area, in the Houston area, in the Austin area, in the San Antonio area, that in maybe some parts of the Corpus Christi area where you find it. But Texas is very big, and it actually has 200 utilities, most of which are co-ops with no funding and no ability to do this, and most of which are city-owned, small cities, and they also don't have the means to do it. But all the wires are interconnected. So ERCOT has places where there's visibility of the grid, but the whole grid doesn't have the same capability. And that's part of the challenge with affordability and how we move forward instead of in harmony, right? And so that this digital divide is happening, and it's creating a problem for the grid. In fact, one would argue that the solution in Puerto Rico after Maria hit and destroyed the country was that they don't have any longer a single grid. They actually created 4 large microgrids. They are standalone and separate. And so the notion of having a Western interconnect, an Eastern interconnect, or a single Texas makes no sense going forward. What you want to do is you want to have 6 grids in Texas and 50 grids in the rest of the country.
Andre, won't you explain to everybody ERCOT? I mean, we throw it around because we've been around it as a management for the roll-up and how that happened with our grid in Texas.
Yeah, ERCOT is just the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, and they're in charge for the balance of the grid at 60 hertz. They're responsible for the reliability of the grid so that every citizen have access to power by law. And they're also responsible for the transaction in the trade of the energy, the power in the wholesale market. So so being the balancing authority and the reliability entity and the settlement entity in one company is very unique. That's not the case in any other state. For example, California does not control all the balance of California. Sacramento has their own balance. LA has their own balance. And Cal ISO only controls part of the country, part of the state's balance. So ERCOT has a great construct. The challenge is what I was saying earlier, that all the actors in Texas don't have the same ability to afford the capabilities of the most sophisticated infrastructure. And because we are all interconnected, the weakest link shows up. The weakest link makes everything be weak.
But we do have something a bit like ERCOT, but not as far-reaching in the marketing organizations that have
Oh yeah.
really
Oh
come
yeah.
to dominate electric supply. But they don't lay down the law, but they do basically lay down the price. And
Correct.
that may, MISO, etc. There are
Yeah.
all these regional
Yeah.
marketing organizations, which when I was active in deregulating electricity, which I now think was probably a mistake, but that was not part of the deal. The deal was not that you would suddenly remove the restraints of the Federal Power Commission, which became FERC, to replace it with the restraint of this marketing giant that's answerable to nobody, whether it's the Midwest one, the Mid-Atlantic one, the California one. We have these marketing, and I'm not sure that they're helpful, but nobody seems to be complaining about them except me and maybe the nuclear industry, because
No,
they tend to favor the spot price as the real price. The spot price is seldom
no, we
anything.
we have 9 trading regions in the U.S. and they work. They work. The challenge is that as we move from a one-way power flow to include distributed introduced next to a two-way power flow, those controls and the way we do buying and selling of energy, it kind of paraphrases back to the New York Stock Exchange before computers and after computers. It used to be that you wrote in a ticket, hey, I want three shares of this company. Oh, I'm selling 3 shares of this company, and we traded, right? And between me giving him that paper and getting the paper and settling the transaction, it would take, 3 days, right? Transactions happen instantaneously. And that's what we're talking about. Today, in the ERCOT market or PJM or Cal ISO, I have a pricing that is put in the market for 15-minute intervals, and the transaction gets settled 30 days after. And so we need to move control of computers real time, right? And that requires that all the assets need to be accessible real time, right? And so that's where we're heading, and it's complicated and it's expensive. It's very expensive.
Yep, that's where we're headed. We got to do
Yeah.
that.
So anyway, I hope that helped on that topic. So any parting thoughts on where we move forward on this sort of pandemic / energy crisis? Llewelyn, where do we go from here? What is the Biden administration going to do? Give us some insight.
Well, it's going to muddle through. Gradually, everybody will get vaccinated. We still have a huge number of scientific question marks hanging over this. What is the duration of the immunity? How thorough is the immunity? Can you have immunity if a large proportion, a large minority of the country has not been vaccinated and won't get vaccinated? And what is the impact and how effective will the vaccines that we have be against mutant strains of the virus? There are more questions than there are answers.
Johnny?
Yes, and remember that one of the things we're not talking about is that in Austin, Texas, all the hotels are full again. So therefore, you cannot find a hotel room in Austin. The question is, to what extent would that lead to another breakout of the virus? So I think that's a very, very interesting question. So all of these things are now becoming interrelated. We have the weather forcing us back into the hotels where we were told not to go. Now the hotels are loaded. They're raising their prices, I might add, in downtown Austin. Out by the bridge in Northwest Austin, where I live, the Arboretum, all those hotels are full. So we're going to go forward in an interesting kind of way. We need great thinkers, we need great leaders of industry, and we need great politicians. As Llewelyn said, we will muddle through this for a while, and then we hope to break out of turbulence, just like on an airplane, into clear weather.
Yeah. Well, I hope
Yeah.
that we can survive until next week. And thank you for being with us today. Johnny, you want to play us away as we have run over the time?
Well,
and thank you, gentlemen, for the discussion today.
You know,
Go ahead.
You know, when there's a problem in Texas, what do? Let's go to Lukenbach, Texas, wailing in the boys. This successful life we're living got us feeling like the Hatfields and McCoys. Between Hank Williams' rain song, Newberry's train song,